What happens when one of Hollywood's most legendary actors meets his match in a late-night host who's completely lost control? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with Stephen Colbert in what starts as a routine interview, but quickly spirals into the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. The tension in that studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And by the end of the night, one of these men would storm off set while cameras were still rolling. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in ways nobody saw coming. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert seemed like any other Tuesday night taping until Harrison Ford walked onto that stage. What the audience didn't know was that behind the scenes, tensions had been brewing all day. Ford, promoting his latest project, had already made it clear to producers that he wasn't in the mood for Colbert's typical brand of political grandstanding. The veteran actor, known for his no-nonsense approach to interviews, had specifically requested that the conversation stay focused on his work, rather than diving into the political commentary that Colbert had become notorious for forcing into every segment. But Stephen Colbert had other plans entirely. As Ford settled into the guest chair, there was an unmistakable edge in the air. The studio audience, completely unaware of what was about to unfold, cheered enthusiastically for the Indiana Jones legend. Colbert's opening was deceptively warm, thanking Ford for being there and making the usual small talk about his latest film. For the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. Ford, though somewhat reserved, was answering questions professionally and even cracking a few of his trademark dry jokes that had the audience laughing. "So, Harrison, you've been in this business for what, 50 years now?" Colbert began, leaning back in his chair with that familiar smirk. "You've seen a lot of changes in Hollywood, a lot of different administrations come and go. I'm curious about your thoughts on how the industry has evolved, especially with everything that's been happening politically." Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him well would have recognized the warning signs immediately. His hands, which had been casually resting on the chair arms, slowly formed into fists. His voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath when he responded. "Stephen, I thought we were here to talk about the film. That's what your people told my people. I'm not really interested in getting into politics tonight." Ford's words were measured, professional, but there was an unmistakable boundary being drawn in the sand. Colbert, however, seemed to interpret this as a challenge rather than a warning. His eyes lit up with that predatory gleam that regular viewers knew all too well, the look he got when he sensed weakness or an opportunity to pounce. Instead of respecting Ford's clear preference, he doubled down. "Oh, come on, Harrison. You can't tell me that someone who's been around as long as you have doesn't have opinions about what's happening in our country. I mean, you've played American heroes on screen for decades. Surely you have thoughts about the real heroes and villains in Washington right now?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Ford's expression hardened, and anyone paying close attention could see the legendary actor's patience beginning to fray at the edges. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly in a posture that those familiar with his work might recognize from his more intense dramatic roles. "I'm here to promote a movie, Stephen. That's it. I'm not your political pundit, and I'm not going to be used as a prop for whatever agenda you're pushing tonight." Ford's voice had taken on a warning tone that would have made Han Solo proud, but Colbert was either too arrogant or too committed to his bit to back down. The host's response. Was everything wrong with modern late-night television distilled into one moment? Instead of gracefully transitioning back to the film, instead of respecting his guest's clearly stated boundaries, Colbert chose to escalate. He leaned forward with that insufferable grin, the one that had alienated half his potential audience over the years. "But Harrison, don't you think that silence in times like these is complicity? I mean, when you have a platform, when you have influence, don't you have a responsibility to speak out against injustice?" That was the moment everything changed. Ford's face went completely stone cold, and the transformation was so dramatic that several audience members actually gasped audibly. The easygoing movie star was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with Hollywood nonsense. Let me make something very clear to you, Stephen. I've been in this business since before you knew what a camera was. I've dealt with directors, producers, and network executives who thought they could manipulate me, use me, put words in my mouth that I never agreed to say. And you know what happened to every single one of them who tried? Ford paused, letting the question hang in the air like a loaded gun. They learned real quick that I don't play those games. The studio had gone dead silent. Even Colbert's usual yes men in the audience seemed to sense that something had gone terribly wrong. But rather than de-escalate, rather than show even an ounce of professionalism or respect for one of cinema's greatest legends, Colbert made the fatal mistake of pushing even harder. Well, I think our audience would be interested in hearing your perspective on no. Ford's interruption was sharp as a blade. Your audience can be interested in whatever they want. I'm not here to perform political theater for you or anyone else. I came here as a professional courtesy to talk about work that I'm proud of, with people who know how to conduct themselves professionally. Clearly, I was misinformed about that last part. The tension had reached a breaking point, but somehow, everyone in that studio knew this was just the beginning. What happened next would go down in television history as one of the most shocking displays of host misconduct ever captured on live television. Instead of recognizing that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures to the absolute limit, Colbert made the catastrophic decision to not just continue his attack, but to make it personal. You know what, Harrison? I think I understand what's really going on here, Colbert said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had made him so many enemies in the industry. You're from a different generation. You're from a time when actors could just stay quiet, take the money, and not worry about the consequences of their silence. But that world is gone, my friend. This is 2025, and people expect more from their heroes. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ford's face went through a transformation that was both terrifying and magnificent to witness. The casual, movie star persona didn't just disappear. It was obliterated, replaced by something that reminded everyone in that room why this man had been able to convince audiences for 50 years that he could take on Nazis, smugglers, and replicants, without breaking a sweat. My friend? Ford's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have managed. Let me tell you something about friendship, Stephen. Friends don't ambush each other. Friends don't lie about what an interview is going to be about. And friends sure as hell don't lecture each other about moral obligations when they don't know the first thing about the person they're talking to. But Colbert, drunk on his own perceived power and the adrenaline of confrontation, pushed even further into dangerous territory. What came next was a masterclass in how to destroy your own career in real time. Oh, so now you're the victim here? Harrison Ford, one of the most privileged actors in Hollywood history, is being victimized by someone asking him to use his platform. Responsibly? Colbert's voice was getting higher, more shrill, as he sensed he was losing control of the situation, but couldn't stop himself from making it worse. Do you have any idea how many people would kill for the opportunity to reach millions of people and actually make a difference? The studio audience was no longer just silent. They were actively uncomfortable. You could see people shifting in their seats, looking around nervously, wondering if they should be witnessing this. Some were pulling out their phones, instinctively knowing they were watching something that would be talked about for years to come. Ford stood up slowly, deliberately, his movements carrying the weight of decades of playing men who didn't take disrespect from anyone. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect he commanded. Platform responsibility. You want to talk about platform responsibility? Ford's voice was building now, not in volume but in intensity. I've been using my platform responsibly for 5 decades. I've supported causes I believe in quietly, without fanfare, without turning every charitable act into a publicity stunt. I've donated millions of dollars to environmental causes, to veterans organizations, to disaster relief efforts. I've done it without press releases, without photo ops, and without sanctimonious late-night hosts telling me how to live my life. The revelation hit the studio like a thunderbolt. Here was information that clearly hadn't been in Colbert's pre-interview. Notes, evidence of a man who had been making a difference without seeking credit for it. But rather than acknowledging his mistake, rather than showing even a shred of humility, Colbert doubled down in the most spectacular fashion possible. Well, if you've been doing all that, then why are you so afraid to talk about it? Why are you so defensive about taking a public stand? Colbert's desperation was becoming obvious now, his voice taking on the whiny quality of a child who knows they've been caught doing something wrong but refuses to admit it. That was the moment Harrison Ford's famous temper, kept in check by decades of professionalism, finally exploded. But it wasn't a wild, uncontrolled rage. It was something far more dangerous. It was the controlled fury of a man who had spent his entire career dealing with people who thought they could manipulate him, and who had finally reached the point where he was done pretending to be polite about it. "Afraid?" Ford's voice cracked like a whip. "You think I'm afraid? Let me tell you what I'm afraid of, Stephen. I'm afraid of little weasels like you who think that having a television show gives you the right to ambush people. I'm afraid of sanctimonious hypocrites who preach about moral responsibility, while they're busy destroying the basic standards of decency that used to exist in this business." The studio was now in complete chaos. Audience members were openly gasping. Some were standing up trying to get a better view. Others were heading for the exits. The production crew was frantically trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. In the control room, executives were having nervous breakdowns in real time. But Colbert, somehow managing to make the situation even worse, decided to get personal in a way that crossed every line of professional conduct. "You know what, Harrison? I think the real problem here is that you're just an old man who can't handle the fact that the world has moved on without you. You're scared because you know that your kind of quiet, do-nothing heroism doesn't work anymore." The words had barely left Colbert's mouth when Ford took a step forward, his entire body language shifting into something that made it clear this was no longer a television interview. This was a confrontation between two men, and one of them had just made a very serious mistake. "My kind of heroism?" Ford's voice was now completely cold, every word carefully chosen and delivered with surgical precision. "My kind of heroism is showing up to work every day for 50 years, treating people with respect, keeping my word, and not using my position to bully people who can't fight back. Your kind of heroism is hiding behind a desk, taking cheap shots at people who are contractually obligated to sit there and take it, and then acting like you're some kind of moral authority." The confrontation had moved far beyond anything that could be salvaged with commercial breaks or editing. This was nuclear, and everyone in that studio knew it. But the worst was still to come. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, dissected by entertainment journalists for weeks, and ultimately mark the beginning of the end for Stephen Colbert's credibility as a professional host. In a move that defied all logic and professional conduct, Colbert decided to make one final, devastating attack that would seal his fate forever. "You know what I think, Harrison? I think you're just another washed-up actor who's desperately clinging to relevance. You come on my show, you refuse to engage with the real issues that matter, and then you have the audacity to lecture me about professionalism? Maybe it's time you realized that your 15 minutes ended about 20 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute terrified silence that occurs when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they've just witnessed something catastrophic. Even Colbert's most loyal staff members were visibly cringing, some covering their faces with their hands, others staring in open-mouthed horror at what their host had just said. Harrison Ford stood completely still for what felt like an eternity, his face a mask of controlled rage that would have made Clint Eastwood proud. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up, but every word carried the weight of 5 decades of earned respect and accumulated fury. 15 minutes? Ford's voice was barely audible, but it commanded absolute attention. You think I've had 15 minutes? Let me tell you about my 15 minutes, you pathetic little man. My 15 minutes started in 1977 with a little movie called Star Wars. It continued through Raiders of the Lost Ark, Blade Runner, The Fugitive, and about 40 other films that will still be watched long after your smug little talk show is forgotten. Ford began moving toward Colbert's desk, not threateningly, but with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision. Every step echoed through the silent studio like a countdown to Judgment Day. But you want to know what my real 15 minutes are? My real 15 minutes are right now, watching a failed comedian who couldn't make it in real entertainment try to destroy the career of someone infinitely more talented than he'll ever be. My 15 minutes are watching you demonstrate to millions of people exactly why late-night television has become a joke, why audiences are abandoning shows like yours in droves, and why hosts like you are being replaced by YouTubers and podcasters who actually know how to treat their guests with basic human decency. Colbert, finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake, tried desperately to regain control of the situation. But it was far too late for damage control, and his attempt only made things worse. Harrison, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just— No. Ford's interruption was sharp and final. We're done here. But before I leave, let me give you and your audience a little education about what professionalism actually looks like. When you invite someone onto your show, you honor the agreements you made with them. When they tell you they don't want to discuss certain topics, you respect that boundary. When you realize you've made a mistake, you apologize like an adult, instead of doubling down like a child. Ford had reached Colbert's desk now, towering over the host who seemed to shrink into his chair with every word. The camera angles made it clear just how pathetic Colbert looked in this moment. A small, petty man who had picked a fight with someone completely out of his league. But most importantly, Ford continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone delivering a final verdict. When you have the privilege of hosting a television show, you use that privilege to elevate your guests, not to tear them down for your own ego. You've failed at every single one of those basic requirements, and frankly, you've embarrassed yourself, your network, and everyone associated with this production. The studio audience was now completely transfixed, watching what was essentially a masterclass in how to destroy someone with nothing but truth and dignity. Some were filming with their phones, others were just staring in amazement at watching a legend defend himself against a bully. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, but it was like watching someone try to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. Harrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This is live television. Emotions run high. Maybe we can— Ford held up a single finger, and Colbert immediately fell silent. The gesture was so commanding, so filled with quiet authority, that it was clear who was in control of this situation now. The only misunderstanding here was mine, Ford said with devastating calm. I misunderstood what kind of person I was dealing with. I thought I was coming on a professional television show hosted by someone who understood basic courtesy. Instead, I find myself dealing with a failed comedian who thinks ambushing his guests makes for good television. Ford straightened up to his full height, and for a moment, he looked every inch the action hero he'd played on screen for decades. But this wasn't fiction. This was a real man defending his dignity against someone who had tried to diminish it. I've been in this business for 50 years, and I've worked with everyone from George Lucas to Ridley Scott to some of the greatest directors and actors in film history. You know what they all had in common? They knew how to treat people with respect. They understood that collaboration requires mutual courtesy. They got where they were by lifting others up, not by tearing them down. Ford began walking toward the edge of the stage, but he wasn't finished yet. You, on the other hand, have built your entire career on cheap shots, political grandstanding, and the kind of petty meanness that passes for humor these days. You hide behind your desk, take shots at people who can't fight back, and then act surprised when someone finally calls you on it. As Ford reached the steps leading off the stage, he turned back one final time to deliver the killing blow. I feel sorry for you, Stephen. I really do. Because someday, when this show is canceled and you're wondering why nobody wants to work with you anymore, you'll remember nights like tonight. You'll remember the moment you had the chance to interview one of the most successful actors in film history, and instead of making great television, you chose to make an enemy. Ford paused at the top of the steps, his silhouette backlit by the stage lights in a way that made him look larger than life. Good luck with your career. You're going to need it. And with that, Harrison Ford walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind the most stunned audience in late-night television history and a host whose credibility would never recover. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's shocked expression and the complete silence of an audience that had just witnessed the destruction of everything their host thought he represented. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were trending on every social media platform, with overwhelming support for Ford and devastating criticism of Colbert's conduct. The incident would mark the beginning of a ratings freefall that would ultimately lead to serious questions about Colbert's future in late-night television, proving that sometimes, when you pick a fight with a legend, you get exactly what you deserve. The last image viewers saw before the show cut to an emergency commercial break was an empty guest chair and Stephen Colbert sitting alone at his desk, finally understanding the true cost of his arrogance. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you thought about this incredible confrontation. Was Harrison Ford justified in his response, or did things go too far? Either way, this is one late-night television moment that will be talked about for years to come.